Hello, this is Travis from the Hemp Mine. What you are watching today is part one of two parts on the topic of photoperiodism. I'm sure some of you who are watching are thinking, what the heck is photoperiodism? But for those of you who are watching who are currently in the hemp industry or the cannabis industry, this is a topic that is not discussed as often as it should be. And the reason that is just because of the nascent and new market of cannabis in general if we compare it to other mature markets. What I'd like to do through this video is, for one, address the concept of photoperiodism, help you have an appreciation for it as well as a basic understanding of what it is, discuss photoperiodic classes, maybe connect some dots between plants that you grew up enjoying and how they're manipulated to flower, similar to how we manipulate cannabis to flower, and then go through some practical scenarios in the greenhouse and in the field on how you can use this understanding to manipulate the crop to your benefit, ultimately increasing your bottom line at the end of the season or at the end of the cycle. First, before we jump into the presentation itself, I want to give you just a quick understanding of my background and why it's pertinent to what we're talking about. Myself, as well as my business partner, Dr. Allison Justice, both of us have been trained in commercial horticulture. I went to school at Clemson and Virginia Tech for environmental horticulture, and then went and worked with one of the largest ornamental crop growers in the country. If we think about agriculture, we have a branch off of agriculture, which is horticulture, right? And this is shrub production, tree production, flower production. But then from horticulture, we have a branch of floriculture. And that is the background that both myself and my business partner have. We have an extensive background in floricultural crop production. The reason I bring this up is because, I think back to my career in the ornamental industry, and I hold that experience of extreme value. This is a mature market. It has a supply chain which has been completely developed, and in many cases, those who are in it understand the potential of it. And the only way to secure more business, or the only way to grow, is to maximize internal production regarding consistency and efficiency to a level that can benefit from shoestring margins at the end of the day. In these mature horticultural and floricultural markets, those that are dealing with such a small margin at the end of the year, they are incentivized to understand crop physiology to a depth at which the cannabis industry has yet to even touch the surface of. But now let's bring some of what we've learned from these mature markets into the cannabis market. Okay? Let's stop in some cases banging our head on the wall saying what's next, and start to truly be innovative and utilize some of the concepts that are already known within mature horticultural markets and start implementing them in the cannabis industry. So through this video, what I'd like to do is I'd like to touch on what the heck is photoperiodism, why does it matter to you, what are photoperiodic classes, what class is cannabis, then let's talk through some scenarios and examples, being indoors, being in a greenhouse, being in multiple different latitudes in the U.S. regarding field production of hemp, and ultimately equip you to maximize the potential of the genetics and of the cannabis plants that you have to increase your bottom line. Okay, and so with that said, let's jump into the meat of this video. Moving forward into the future, the Hemp Mine will release what we're calling our technical support series. And the first topic that we'll be discussing is photoperiodism. And again, like I said, I will be presenting on part 1, and later on Allison will launch another video which will be presenting on part 2. So, what is photoperiodism? Just so that whomever is watching, I want us all to be on the same page. I'm going to read exactly what this first bullet says. Photoperiodism is a physiological response in multiple different plant species that dictates whether or not the plant is focused on vegetative growth or reproductive growth. This response in photoperiodic plants is dictated based on the amount of darkness a plant receives during a single 24-hour period and then consistently thereafter. I know many of you have heard the term photoperiod, and this refers to the amount of light hours in a given 24-hour period. You know, humans work during the day. We see when the lights are on or the sun is out. We work during the day. And so when we discuss photoperiodic plants, we discuss the photoperiod, the amount of time light is on or the sun is out. We do not discuss the duration of the night period, even though we know that the length of the night period obviously correlates with the length of the day when we're only focused on discussing a 24-hour period. But we know that plants ultimately perceive the length of the night. So moving forward, when discussing photoperiodic plants, and I say photoperiod, I'm talking about the length of the day and not the length of the night. There are different types of photoperiodic classes, and these classes include long day plants, short day plants, day length neutral. Cannabis falls into the short day plant category. And what this means is, in order to maximize the potential of this crop, based specifically, in certain facets of the market that you're participating in, we need to maximize the production of this plant by giving it a long day, followed then by a short day, and this transition from a long day to a short day initiates flowering, causes the plant to go from vegetative growth to reproductive growth. Okay, and so that's a short day plant, long day and then a short day. And then for long day plants, it's flipped. In some cases, in order to maximize the potential of other species, you have to give them a short day followed by a long day. And in the cannabis industry, there's also much discussion around autoflower genetics, and autoflower, I believe, is a little bit different than day neutral, but very very similar concepts. That you're not subject to the length of the day. It's more of either an accumulation of growth that triggers flower development. But what we're going to focus on today is short day plants. However, I do want to make one more thought apparent here. There are additional characteristics that can be attached to these photoperiodic classes, right? So it can go even a level deeper in the complexity of these different flowering responses. And so, for example, you could even have obligate short day plants or facultative long day plants. I'll give one example of this. So a good example of a facultative long day plant is greenhouse vine crop tomatoes. In some cases, it's been proven that they are facultative long day, which means the longer the day, the better regarding flower development and fruit set. However, they have also learned that there is something as too long of a day. So, just keep in mind that we're having to navigate through these different flowering responses for multiple crops, and it is certainly nothing new. So growing up, I'm sure maybe your mom had garden mums on the porch in the fall, and if not, had Christmas poinsettias on the fireplace. But these plants have the exact same, if not very similar, short day photoperiodic nature to them that cannabis has. And these plants have been grown for decades, and we've learned an extreme amount from maximizing the production of these plants. And so one thing I like to just point out is this is nothing new. Why is the cannabis industry not talking about photoperiodism when it's how we dictate and forecast production of these other crops? We should. So with a basic understanding of what photoperiodism is, and understanding that cannabis is a short day crop, meaning that you need a short day preceded by a long day in order to trigger flowering, let's now look at an example of an indoor schedule. This schedule here is just an example. I will admit that this schedule is widely used within completely climate-controlled medical marijuana facilities to smokable flower greenhouse hemp facilities. But let's just break it down and just walk through it so that we understand how to look at this from a crop development standpoint as well as a production stage standpoint. So if we look at the top of the graphic here, I have production stage. So we have propagation, then I have the vegetative stage in other mature markets. In some cases you call this bulking, and then we have flower development. These are three specific different production stages. Under that we have week number. This is not year week, this is week number within this single cycle. And so let's start with discussing propagation. In propagation, and I'm focusing on schedules that originate from using vegetative material. So in propagation, let's say that you have mother stock growing and you take a cutting, and for this example, let's use a 72 cell tray. You take a cutting, an unrooted clone, and you stick this in a 72 cell tray in a propagation environment. You ideally can root this between 14 to 21 days. For the sake of the example, I used 14. In a perfect world, we could root everything in 14 days. So we have the understanding of, okay, we need to go through propagation first. We need to root these plants, but what crop development stage do we want to keep them in? We want to keep them in a vegetative state. So we apply a long day. And in this case, we apply an extremely long day of 18 hours. You know, if it's been interesting for me to understand why the cannabis industry by default is using 18 hours as a long day and 12 hours as a short day. And what we've come up with is that, you know, if you were to open a crop physiology book and you were to read through, I guess, the photoperiodism section, by the book, for most plants, a long day is anything above 12 hours, so the day length of anything longer than 12 hours, and a short day is 12 hours or less. And so within the cannabis industry, it's widely used that 12 hours is the photoperiod at which you should initiate flowering with, and I do believe that that's just because by the book, that's what it says. We also are using 18 hours as a long day because that's an extremely long day. We're pretty much guaranteed that that plant is going to stay vegetative. So that's why in this example I show 18-12, because in most cannabis facilities throughout the world, they're using this lighting schedule, which I hope after we watch this video, for those of you that are growing indoors, let's challenge this a little bit, okay? So let's move from propagation and now discuss the vegetative stage of crop production. And so from propagation, like I said, we have a 72 cell tray that's been rooted between 14 to 21 days. We're still under a long day because we want to keep the plants vegetative. Now let's transplant these rooted clones, these liners, into larger pots and perhaps move them into a different room or move them and space them out in the greenhouse and keep them again under long days for 3 more weeks so that we can build some size on these plants. The vegetative part of this cycle is focused on these plants building a root system, focusing on leaf development, shoot development, cell elongation, cell division, making these plants grow and bulk and get bigger in size, ultimately influencing where you have flowers being developed and ultimately dictating the amount of yield you get at the end of the cycle. So the vegetative cycle and maximizing it is very important for cannabis. So we've gone from propagation, we've now transplanted, we've gone through vegetative growth, we've kept both production stages under the same crop developmental stage by applying long days. Now we do what's called flipping of the photoperiod. all we do is we reduce the amount of light hours from 18 to 12. And what does that do? It extends the length of the night, right? This in short day plants triggers them into flower initiation or into a reproductive state. And then as you see here on week 6, we start to initiate flowering, and depending on whether you're a marijuana grower trying to produce as much THC as possible, or you're a hemp grower that is trying to push the limits with CBD while still making sure that you stay compliant with 0.3 total THC, you would then take your cannabinoid tests throughout this flower development part of the cycle, and that would influence when you ultimately harvest this crop. So with that basic schedule understood for indoor production of cannabis or hemp, let's look at some pictures that have been grown under a very similar schedule. So the picture that I just brought up here, this is an example of what's called a sea of green, okay? And so I wonder if my mouse will work. It will. So most likely they had 2 weeks, if not 3, whatever it took to root the plants, they had that same duration as part of what we see here on this example. But what they did is they didn't allow the plants to get very big before they flowered them. And that could be due to the regulations per state, if they're required to have a certain amount of plant count versus taking up amount of space, whatever it may be. They've chosen to have more plants per their area with less amount of a vegetative cycle throughout that production cycle. So what they've done is they've transplanted these plants that have rooted, and they have a very high density planting that they give a very short window of vegetative growth so the plants don't get too big, and then they initiate flowering, and that's how you have a sea of green. In this example, which I hope you can see, I could have cropped it a little better, but you can see that each individual plant is much larger than the plants over here in the sea of green example. And what this shows us is that they did the same thing. Most likely they propagated these plants in 2 to 3 weeks. They then transplanted them into much larger pots, spaced them at much wider spacing, and they gave these plants a longer vegetative cycle to build mass on these plants. And so most likely this scenario has used the 3 to 4 week vegetative period, versus here that most likely used 1, if not 1.5 to maybe 2 weeks. And it shows you the difference in plant size, and ultimately it will influence the yield per plant. All of what you see is dictated based on understanding the photoperiodic nature of cannabis and how you manipulate its light cycles. All right, so let's move on to discussing production of cannabis outdoors. This is where the Hemp Mine gets quite passionate, because obviously we are a hemp company and our main target customer is a field farmer. We are working very closely with greenhouse customers, but we ourselves are vertically integrated. We grow 60 acres of hemp we're on our 3rd year now. And so we want to offer as much technical support to field farmers as possible. For one, knowing the risk that we're all taking going into this from the start, as well as understanding how volatile the market value of the final product is. Okay, so let's look at the map itself. So once this video is published, you will have a tab on our website that is labeled as HPM, the hemp planting map. We have here a good description, high level, on how to use it, what to look for, and the purpose of the map, but ultimately this video is meant to show you how to use it. I do want to shout out to Joanne Logan at the University of Tennessee. She was the climatologist that helped us compile all of the data for this map and also helped us put it into a functional and interactive format. So thank you very much, Joanne, for helping us do this and make this data available to farmers. So let's step back for a second, and we talked about an indoor crop schedule, and we talked about the importance of applying long days, right, to help the plant bulk in size. In the field, you don't have the ability to manipulate lighting like you do in a greenhouse or an indoor environment. So you have to strategically plan your production outdoors so that you maximize the environment at the location where you are. So with this said, there are key environmental factors that you should think about when determining when to plant at your location. And these are your frost date, or excuse me, your frost potential, the date at these different frost potentials, and the day length. Okay, so let's dive into the map itself. As you can see, if you press and drag, it is interactive, okay? And all of these different dots that you see on the map are specific locations that have environmental data tied to them. So for the sake of this example, let's look at Lansing, Michigan. So I'd zoom in, and you can press and drag, right? And let's click on, I believe this is Lansing, so East Lansing. It gives you some basic information in this data table, so it shows the latitude, longitude, elevation, the state, the city name. But let's expand it so we can wrap our heads around what is the valuable data at this location. So what you see here on the left, it says date, and then it has a percentage, okay? The date right here is May 15th, but what's important to understand is the percentage here. This is the potential of frost. And so we've given it to you pretty much from 100% to 10%. So at 90% chance of frost in Michigan, the date would be April 12th, but then you would have a 10% chance of frost on May 15th. And so it shows you kind of the potential of frost, because as we all know, the last thing you want to do is plant too early, especially clones, and the frost come through and kill all of your plants. And so then if we scroll down, we understand the date that correlates with the frost potential. Now let's figure out the day length. So you come down to 10% chance of frost, which we had up here, and we see DL. This is day length. And so on May 15th, we have 10% chance of frost. And also on May 15th, we have a day length of 14 hours and then 65% out of 100 regarding minutes. And so let me dive in a little bit deeper to explain to you how you should look at this specific data point so that we totally grasp what it's saying about photoperiod and the day length. So let me highlight this so that we're all on the same page. So on May 15th, we have a 10% chance of frost, but our day length, as notated here on the Hemp Mine hemp planting map, is 14 hours, 0.65. Okay, what does this mean? It means that we have 14 hours plus 65% of an additional hour. For how we had to format this, we couldn't make the 0.65 be minutes. We had to make it be a percentage of an additional hour. So let's just break this down really simply so it's not confusing. Since it is a percentage, let's turn this into a pie chart. And in this case, we could think of a clock as a pie chart, right? Because in a clock, 60 minutes equals 100%. And so what is 65% of a full hour? 39 minutes. So there we go. That tells us that this photoperiod is 14 hours and 39 minutes, because 39 minutes is 65% of 1 hour. Okay, so now that we understand this, let's look at two practical examples. The first one being in Lansing, Michigan, like I showed before, and the second one being in Alexandria, Louisiana. All right, so same location. You can see here in the clip at the bottom right that I chose the exact same data box that we were just looking at when looking at the interactive hemp planting map. I've put it into a format so that we could run through this example pretty quickly. So what I have here up on the left is it shows frost potential, the day length, the year week, as some growers use that, and then also just the day of the year, okay? In this scenario, if we were working with a farmer in Lansing, Michigan, and that farmer wanted to plant Southern Cat Daddy for outdoor field smokable flower production, we would go about recommending when he plant based on this exact example right here. Southern Cat Daddy has a flowering response time of 14 hours, right? So that means that any day length longer than 14 hours will ensure that it stays vegetative, and any day length shorter than 14 hours will trigger it into flower initiation. Okay, so we want to make sure that we plant when the day length is longer than 14 hours so that it can focus on vegetative growth and continue that growth throughout the majority of the season and get bigger and bigger and bigger. So over here, I show frost potential, and I started on April 29th. April 29th, we have a photo period of 14 hours. This is right at the line, right? So I would not recommend planting at 14 hours, as that is this cultivar's flowering response time exactly. It would go into flower if planted April 29th. Also, you have a 60% chance of frost. With the risk and investment that you're taking upfront anyway with this crop, do you also want to risk frost? I don't think so. So we would not recommend planting in Michigan, in Lansing, Southern Cat Daddy on April 29th. We then would say, okay, what's our next best option? We go a week later, we have May 6th. Photo period has increased 19 minutes. So we could actually plant Southern Cat Daddy because now the day length is longer than 14 hours and it would stay vegetative. However, we have a 40% chance of frost. I again would say, heck no, we're not risking it yet. What's our next option? And so then you see here we have 20% chance, May 13th, 14 hours and 47 minutes, definitely long enough to plant. But for the sake of this example, I would recommend, okay, at 10% chance of frost, let's get these plants in the ground. Your day length is definitely long enough. This is at the end of May. Let's not waste any more time to get the plants in the ground. Then, once plants are planted, they're growing, they're establishing, they're focusing on vegetative growth. You have a natural distribution of day length throughout the year, right? So in the spring, it slowly gets longer, and then as you hit the solstice, it peaks, and then the day lengths get shorter as you go into fall. And so if we follow that throughout the season, the plant stays vegetative and initiates flowering when day lengths come back down to 14 hours. And so on August 12th, Southern Cat Daddy would initiate flowering in Lansing, Michigan, because we've hit 14 hours. So in Lansing, Michigan, this is when I would recommend to this farmer with this cultivar when to plant, because this would allow them to have 11 weeks of vegetative grow time. This would allow the plants to really fill out in size. And it truly should dictate the amount of plants they plant per acre based on the amount of vegetative growth time that they do have. So now let's look at the exact same cultivar in Louisiana, a much more southern latitude in the city of Alexandria, Louisiana. So we would look at the data from the map right here. Just shows another screenshot of it. Thankfully, we don't have to worry too much about frost, but the day lengths are much shorter than they are in Michigan at the same dates. So again, I referenced the same week 17, the same date, April 29th. We have 10% chance of frost, not a big concern. However, our day length is really short at 13 hours and 21 minutes. Definitely do not want to plant Southern Cat Daddy would prematurely go into flower. So we would recommend that they actually plant June 3rd because your day length is right over 14 hours, and we would hope that this would ensure that it stays vegetative, if not planting a little later. However, their natural distribution of long days peaks and falls much sooner than what we saw in Michigan. And their plant, Southern Cat Daddy, would go into flower initiation on July 1st. And so in Louisiana, with the exact same cultivar, you would have only 3 weeks of vegetative growth. This plant would be much smaller than the plants in Michigan. However, keep in mind, they're the same cost, and most likely other breeding companies are recommending that you plant them at the same crop density as well. That's not how we should do this. So what the Hemp Mine would do is, knowing all of this data going into it, also knowing the objective of your production and what final product you want to offer to the market and when, we would allow you to understand this like we do through this kind of example, but offer a solution that would match a similar grow time in Louisiana to the farmer in Michigan. And how do we do that? We do that through offering a different cultivar that has a shorter flowering response time. So in Michigan, this is the example of Southern Cat Daddy, 11 weeks pretty much of vegetative growth time. In Louisiana, only 3. So what we would do is we would recommend a cultivar named Southern Sunset to lower latitude states. And in Alexandria, Louisiana, it would allow this farmer to have this vegetative crop schedule instead of the 3-week Southern Cat Daddy vegetative crop schedule. And that's because Southern Sunset has a response time of 13 hours and 20 minutes, not 14 hours. So now the grower in Louisiana can be competitive in plant size and yield per acre when planting the same crop density as the farmer in Michigan. This data dictates when to plant, crop density per acre, ultimately what genetics you should choose, and when ultimately to start testing, because this is when the plants will go into flower initiation. And so from here is when you should count down pretty much to harvest, and when you should start taking your first cannabinoid tests on week 1, 2, or 3 after flower initiation. So this chart just shows you the response time of each of our cultivars. We will expand on this. We're coming out with a new catalog for 2021, and we will elaborate on this more with actually having more cultivars as well. We work very closely with a lab partner, Kacha Labs, and with them we are able to offer our customers discounts on cannabinoid tests, because we do recommend that you take quite a few throughout the flower development production stage of your crop cycle. But ultimately, what we would do for each of our customers is create a schedule like this for you after we're on the same page with what genetics you want to use for what purpose and at which location. We create a crop schedule for you, helping you understand, okay, when you need to plant, when these plants will go into flower initiation, and when you should start testing, and give you all of the proper information for how to test, how to sample, where to send your samples, all of that. Okay, so this concludes part 1 of photoperiodism. Part 2 will be coming soon. We will release this before the end of 2020. So stay tuned for Dr. Justice, as we will dive a little deeper into the flowering physiology of cannabis. During our 2020 field trials, we have noticed some very interesting responses, which are leading us to expand our short day plant understanding even further.